In this video, I'm going to draw this thing, a fantasy illustration that I'm going to create from start to finish in a fully narrated real-time tutorial. And while I do that, I'm going to talk about something I think is really interesting. The concept of a lot of artists these days creating IP, their own personal worlds and creations, but often without any real goal. I'm going to discuss how important I think it is to have a goal, to have something you're actually doing if you want to actually build IP, if you want to create something really meaningful. So we'll discuss that, and as usual, for a Drawing Codex video, this is going to be neither fast-paced nor heavily edited. This is just real time. It's you and me. I'm going to show you how I create this illustration from start to finish in real time. There's no edits, there's no nothing. So hopefully that sounds interesting, and hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about line and color illustration, the same style that I create all my comics and illustrations in, you can check out my free quick start guide. It's aimed to get you up and running quickly in Photoshop, developing your own simple, reliable line and color process. It's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out. So the reason I want to talk about this concept of world building and this idea of IP is that I think this is important. I think a lot of us are creative individuals, and especially when we are interested in designing and concept art, and we often don't get to make our own things, and it can be really good to just work on your own project. Often artists know about the value of intellectual property, of IP, but I do feel like, and this was a great question that came up a long time ago actually, where someone was saying what do you think about people who are making their own little projects and things? Like, is there any value in building IP if you're kind of just building it for the sake of building it? Like, is that actually valuable, right? Like, intellectual property is only really good if it's valuable, right? Otherwise, it's just stuff you're kind of doing and there's not really any point to it. So I wanted to kind of try and discuss this and talk about the value of lore building and how it relates to you creating actual projects and products and things, and just this whole concept of world building and IP, etc. So this is a bit of a tangled topic, but hopefully this is something that's interesting to you. If you've seen artists out there who are really good making their own IP, what's the deal with that? Again, do I think it's valuable? We're going to unpack this in excruciating detail in this episode. Okay, let's jump in and get started. Now, before I actually start drawing and we start talking about this concept of world building, let me go over some basics, because sometimes I skip these and people kind of ask me questions, which is totally fair enough. What I'm doing here is starting with a template, and this is back from the days when I guess Instagram was square and thus the world was square, but I still kind of like the square format. And what I like to do is create a template so that, you know, I'm not messing around, I'm not sketching around, I have a really clear idea of what my outcome is. And I'm not going to be doing world building here. I'm not going to be doing any sort of design stuff. I'm really focusing here on working on my illustration skills. And these are very similar to the things that I teach when I'm teaching courses, teaching students how to use the line and color process. So I'll talk a little bit through that as we progress. But yeah, what I do is I have a template file. It's preset. It has my little website and my sort of signature there, so that, you know, when it's all done, I can just click save and we're done. So that's the goal, is really to kind of minimize anything from me kind of finishing it or saying like, hey, is this done? Could I send this? And that being able to be the case. So I think that's often, you know, happens when you're kind of sketching around, you're messing around, and then you're like, oh, is this an illustration? Like, what am I doing? Like, what is this? Again, often the question is like, is this world building? Is this like, what am I doing? Here, it's very clear. The point is to fill this up with something interesting. So the way I start is actually here with a pencil sketch that I have just taken a photo with on my phone. I sort of put that on my computer via Dropbox, and then I just kind of resize it. Be a similar process if I kind of went here and maybe just kind of did a little sketch or something like that. And, you know, often I'll sort of do that as a thumbnail, and then I'll kind of resize it, right? And just sort of be like, okay, within this frame, how big should this thumbnail be? Again, that often gives me a little bit of flexibility. The goal here, though, as I said, is to work the illustration. So I'm just going to be using a very simple process here. I have the thumbnail, which is step 1, and I'm going to be using what I like to call my simple, reliable process. This is something that I often teach as part of the line and color sort of educational stuff, where we have a thumbnail and we're not going to create anything fancy in terms of process. We're going to be using the simplest tools, the simplest techniques. So I'll just kind of start drawing and I'll sort of talk you through some of that. So I've got this scanned pencil sketch. It's not white. It's kind of really rough. I'm not adjusting the levels. All I'm doing is just putting a white layer above it, reducing the opacity. And you can think of this as a bit of tracing paper. Now I'm just going to do what I call the construction drawing. And the tool that I'm using is literally, it's the worst tool probably for drawing you could have in Photoshop. It is just the pencil tool in Photoshop set to 10 pixels, and it's just black. But this should allow me to just do some simple drawing. And what I'm going to do here is what I call the construction phase. So when I'm talking about a simple, reliable process, really it's just a matter of thinking about breaking down the process into a very small, simple set of tools, a simple set of steps, but that still allow me to create some sense of structure and to improve my drawing and to improve my illustration. So one of the things I'm doing here is I make sure that even though I have that thumbnail phase, that the next phase I'm choosing is what I call the construction phase. And that allows me to have a real go at being messy. And this is, I think, a really important part when you're developing, to have a part of your process where you can just be messy, right? Like I can do construction, I can do my Loomis, your Riley method, whatever method of construction you really sort of like to employ, and I can be messy. And I'm going to take that thumbnail and I'm going to take the pressure off me doing the thumbnail in some crazy detailed way, because I know, right, like when this is done, I'm going to have another pass at it, right? Like when the thumbnail is done, I am going to have another go at the construction. And this takes all the pressure off me doing this at the thumbnail phase, right? Like making sure anything's right. So basically I can reconstruct the figure, I can, start from scratch again. And I just think this is a really sort of simple, easy way to work. And basically what comes after that, we have thumbnail, detailed construction phase that you can put as much time into as you want. Make sure it's right, keep erasing. No one's ever going to see this, right? At the end of the day, I'll be doing some finished lines over the top of this. That's what we'll see. And yeah, the next thing is finished lines or your kind of inking. And after that, I'm just going to do some simple flat color. So very simple process. And again, what I like to think of here is that really what I'm doing is giving myself a simple series of techniques, a simple series of tools. I kind of know where I am in the process. It's my process. It's something I teach, but it's also a matter of you figuring out exactly which steps you use and practicing them so that you can then have a go right here and do these sort of little assignments, little drawings, little illustrations. And what I find is really useful about doing this and doing these is that this kind of allows me to work my illustration skills, right? What I'm going to try and do is think about what is my 1, 2, 3 read? What is the, like, where am I going to lead the eye? Is this going to be a vignette? I mean, I think this is like a good candidate for sort of a vignette style illustration. I can think about where I'm going to use color theory to lead the eye. And I'm going to do this in a fairly short amount of time because, again, the point here is to just practice, right? To put in some reps, as they say, right? To practice and see where this goes. So yeah, the tools are going to be really simple. I have this as my pencil tool, which is just literally, it's the pencil tool in Photoshop. It has sort of thick to thin, and if you sort of zoom up, you can see it's just that sort of jagged, right? But this just forces me to say, let's not make pretty pictures. Let's focus here on drawing, right? And I think one of the things that is interesting, and again, we will get to sort of talking about world building in a minute. One of the things that I find really interesting about drawing digitally. And one of the reasons I often like to make it ugly is that I really find it's challenging to make a digital sketch look nice. One of the things that is so frustrating that I see people be often frustrated with when it comes to digital is the fact that you just don't get that kind of really nice look, right? You just never get that really nice look that like a beautiful pencil sketch just has this great quality to it. And so often when we're kind of doing that, you kind of lament the loss of that sort of pencil sketch phase. And you kind of just want everything to be that sort of nice sketchy look. I think with digital, for me anyway, it's always just been never matching up to that feeling of pencil. It's never been matching up to that feeling of what it's like to have that kind of nice texture you get with pencil, that the surface of the paper isn't there, right? It's kind of a bit awful, right? Like as good as it gets, it's still, it's still a 3 out of 10 versus a 10 out of 10 when it comes to drawing with a really nice pencil on some really nice paper, right? We think about that as being sort of the gold standard. Even the best like Apple Pencil, the best sort of Wacom technique, the best everything, it's still so inferior in the way it looks, in the way it feels, all of that. So often I like to lean into that. I'm like, you know what? Let's just get this done. Let's try and not get attached to this fancy drawing, right? The pencil is never, the pencil phase digitally, I find is probably never going to look really nice. So who cares? Let's just see where it goes. So that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be using very simple techniques, very simple flat colors, and I'm just practicing illustration. Just getting used to it. And this is like this is what my friend Matt Rhodes would call sharpening the knife, right? Practicing, just putting in the reps. Maybe there's things I've learned, and one of the other things I often teach when it comes to line and color and process in general and kind of what you're doing is that, like I will learn things, and I think we'll all sort of learn things over the years, over the days. Like one of the books that I recently got, someone sort of recommended it in my community, is Framed Environment Design by Marcos Matu Mestre. And this is an amazing book. It's really good, So you'll often be like sort of learning things and looking at something and being like, oh, that's a cool idea. And having these kind of regular times where you can say, now I'm gonna do something with some illustrative intent, where I'm gonna think about not the environment, but some of the compositional things that I may have heard there. I may have been looking at some reference, so you kind of get psyched up. You need to apply this stuff, right? And so often when I'm doing sort of comics, right, which is what I would be sort of doing for work at the moment, I've just been storyboarding for the last many, many months. And so I haven't been doing any illustration. So this is a long way to say, I think like having some sort of thing where you can just work and practice illustration and have that as like, this is my goal. Try and make a pretty picture, right? Like whatever it may be. I'm not really digging this anatomy here. I'm like, do I need more? I feel like that we need more forehead or something. Have a think about it. Just pull that up a bit. Come on. I think I'm on my, there we go. My workstation. This is the recording PC I use, and often the workstation that I'd actually draw on all day is more finely tuned. Photoshop always reinstalls, like Photoshop these days updates, reinstalls. And then it changes all the settings and things. Anyway, not really a fan of this face. But this is what the construction phase is for. Like having a phase here where like none of these marks that I'm making are sort of perfect. None of them are final. right, is great. This means I can rearrange, I can play around, I can be like, maybe I need to do less structure, right? Maybe this needs to just be a little bit of playing around with sort of practicing the final lines. Maybe this is something where I need to go back and like reconstruct the face in its entirety. Who knows? We will see. Boom. So let's talk about this idea, this concept of world building, which, as I said, is not what I'm doing here. I'm just practicing illustration. I guess the real thing that I see, and a lot of this is inspired by a couple of comments that people have sort of left saying exactly this, like, what do you think about everyone sort of making IP, right? Like making their like IP as opposed to doing something with it. And one of the things I'm sort of doing this month is doing some videos on world building, talking about this concept. So I thought it would be a good thing to discuss, because I know a lot of people hear everyone talking about, hey, this is my IP, I'm working on my IP, I'm doing my IP, right? Like all this kind of stuff. And I think it can be tricky to know, like, is this a good idea? Is this something I should be doing? Yeah, all of that stuff. And I think, I guess, like, the issue there is that, like, this is a great idea, like building your own world, building your own things, thinking about the concept of intellectual property as an artist, right? Like thinking about the concept of building up your own world, your own things that you own, I think is like such a good idea. And I think it's a shame that I feel like a lot of the work that I see being sort of done in this area, I feel like is maybe energy that could be a little bit more cleanly directed. This is a great idea. I think it's something everyone should be doing. But I think that because a lot of the people who are doing this, and I would sort of include myself in this, as we sort of come from a concept design background, and we get sort of trained and taught to create other people's ideas, right? We make other people's ideas. We make other people's things. And I think I'm like, how many million people are going to give me like weird comments for putting a knife here? Maybe I should try and put it somewhere else. It'll be like, oh, we'll see. We'll see how many comments people get. I think there's probably going to be too many comments of people being like, that's where swords go, guys. Like, where do you think they're going to go? Maybe we could put it right on the back here, or maybe a little bit higher up or something. These are the things you learn after making art on YouTube all the time. Yeah, so we're often making work for other people, and we are making this IP, and we see how valuable it is, and we see how fun it is. And I know a lot of really high-end concept designers, people who work on epic AAA games and, have really successful careers. A lot of the time they sort of talk about, because I do make comics, and that is a form of like making my own thing. A lot of people do really yearn to make their own work, right? And they talk about this idea of building their own IP, and because they probably understand the industry, that, maybe this is something they could sell, or they want to make an art book with their own IP in it. They want to sort of move from just being like that cog in the machine to someone who has more creative clout, I guess. And I think it's just something in general. I have a few Visual Scholar podcast episodes coming up soon talking about the idea of building worlds being like a really good sort of idea. So I do think this is a good idea. I think the problem that we often find is like we aren't really trained to think about, as concept artists though, like what that IP is for and the nature of IP. So that's really sort of what I think is probably worth talking about, is if you're thinking about like, how do I direct my energy as an artist? How do I direct my energy into a project, right? How do I do this properly? I think that's the fundamental question here. And I think that it's important to understand that people connect with this IP and this lore that we build as a backdrop. So I think it's good to look, firstly, we look at like the functional reason that often this more extreme lore gets created and the background that we have to go through as concept artists, as world builders, to make believable worlds. Is that like, yes, this is important. And often this is the difference, right? Like this is the difference between something feeling good, right? Like something feeling authentic and something feeling sort of cheap and fake and like, you know, this doesn't feel like a real world. One of the things I kind of talk about is, you know, this is often the difference, building good IP, good world building, good development. It's the difference between like a low budget cheap film, right, where it feels like everyone just kind of went to a costume shop and bought a whole bunch of costumes off eBay, and then they just kind of pretended, right, to have this kind of low level set, and it just is not convincing, right? It's almost like a play or something from primary school, right, where you're kind of just pretending, right? You got to use your you got to suspend your disbelief to a really high degree, versus, you know, a really well designed high budget film is going to have the sets dressed really well, and it's the same for video games. And so as you're walking through it, it just has this sense of authenticity to it that is very captivating. And it's often this that we need in order to really believe things, right? Like one of the interesting things that really stuck in my mind was like when they made the first Lord of the Rings trilogy, they put a lot of effort into making the costumes feel authentic, because I think a lot of people making them were just sort of nerdy costume people, but they kind of built the inside of a lot of the armor. This is my understanding anyway. And like the swords actually worked, right? You could actually draw the sword out. It wasn't all a prop, it was heavy. So when people are walking around in heavy armor, it feels real. And when people are putting on the armor, they feel as if I'm putting on a real suit of armor, because it's kind of functional. It's not just polystyrene and fake junk. And it's that extra fidelity that the actor feels, and that brings out that extra 5 or 10% of their conviction as an actor. And it's often like these subtle things that you kind of see, where if everyone sort of gets on board and we all kind of have these experiences and start to believe in the world, it just kind of lifts the whole thing to a whole nother level. Versus, just sort of being like, here's a fake plastic sword, or one of the other things that is very similar to this that sort of Christopher Nolan said in a couple of interviews. Christopher Nolan, director of, sort of the early Batman Begins films, hopefully you know who Christopher Nolan is. He said, one of the things you never want to do when you're making a low budget film is give away that this is low budget. So he's like, you would never have like a plastic gun, because it's just cheap and people don't respect it. The actors don't respect it. They all kind of know it's a rubber gun. So just don't have one, right? Like just don't have a gun. Like don't do anything that would give away the low budget nature of your film. Now, again, we're talking about the fact that like you can draw a gun and you can make it feel heavy, but you often also need to know how to do that. You need to know and build the world and understand how the technology functions, how the what it looks like. We have to understand how that would sort of affect the characters. And this is often what we're doing when we're sort of world building. We're creating creatures and monsters. We're trying to make this world feel believable. But the thing is that often, like as a professional, we are just one small cog in that machine. And I think often what happens, this hand is meant to carry a sword. Yeah, I think often what happens is that we just don't really see the other things that are happening behind the scenes that really go into making that function. All right, here we go. Another sword thing. So again, just being super lazy with this this kind of construction phase. I'm taking quite a while to do it, but that's all right. Boom. So this is the idea, right? Is that the work that we do to create the worlds, to create the background, the depth, to think through how a lot of these fantastical things function, to design how robots look so that it feels as if that might actually work, you know, that they could actually walk around. There's all these like little subtle things that are a part of what we do. And I think often that is what people think that building intellectual property is like, we're just doing that, but we're sort of doing it for us. And I think it's important to understand that I don't think that's quite how it works. And if you are looking to build your own world or your own thing, it's good to look at what the actual purpose of that is. And I think this is so critical to understand. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples that I think are sort of worth looking at here in relation to this. But often when you look into a world and when you really like a world, when something is kind of working, right, like Lord of the Rings, like Star Wars, like Star Trek, like these sort of great things, and some of the examples I'm going to use are Warhammer 40K, like Star Wars, Star Trek. These are kind of big things that a lot of people, I guess, have experience with, so they're pretty easy to use as examples. Now, these are all sort of worlds that have, you know, fairly sort of established, lengthy, detailed canon, right? Canon being things that are considered to be true within that world. And these have been developed over time, although I think Star Wars has had a lot of its canon rewritten recently once sort of Disney bought them and, you know, they kind of wiped the slate clean, destroyed a lot of the extended world stuff. So again, you know, what is canon, what is not, is sort of tricky to understand. But, you know, what makes these worlds good is that when you really like it, right, you've sort of been drawn into a world, let's say Star Wars, by watching A New Hope, and you really like this idea, right? This story has captivated you. You like the theme of the story. You like the concept of the main character, of their character arc, right? That you're captivated by the world. Then you go look at it, right? Like, what makes a good world and a good IP is that, like, there's people have actually put work into it. So when you go look into it, there's more there. And that's what's often really exciting about these things, is to learn more about it. And when you're really excited about one of these things, this is often what people do. And we just like to know that, like, this thing's real, right? We like the fun, I think anyway, of continuing that sense of disbelief. And enjoying that idea, right? And this would be the same with something like Harry Potter, right? Where people think about which house they're in, you know, and would you be in this or this, right? Like, and it's having some coherency to the world so that kind of makes sense is good, right? And, you know, this allows you to enjoy the work more, I think anyway. I think that's one of the primary functions of the lore, right? Is that it kind of allows us to appreciate the work when we're watching it more, and also to rewatch it and to reread it and to re-engage with it and understand, like, this is something that feels real, and that's just fun. It's fun when we have consistency to these fantastical worlds. We're often looking for patterns and ways to express that, and I think this is one of the primary reasons why these sort of fantastical realms and stories and ideas are just interesting. The more that the world feels real, the more we can relate to it and see ourselves in it, and then the more that it can help us on our journey. I think that's one of the primary uses of fiction. And this would go for video games, for everything, right? Even when it's something very whimsical, like a Mario game, where it kind of doesn't make sense. Again, there is a consistency to it that allows you to just kind of have fun, and people kind of enjoy learning about, some of the background and some of the little bits and pieces. Probably not to the same degree as, other kind of stories, but everything kind of has this, right? Everything has like a consistency, so that if you to repeat it, that it actually has some intellectual property. And again, the more you can create this, the better. But it's important to understand that there is really to support the main thing, right? The main book, video game, movie, comic, like whatever it is, that is the thing that is actually important. Without the movie, without Star Wars, without A New Hope, there really is no extended world, there's no nothing. You really do need that actual product and manifestation of the lore to make it valuable intellectual property. So we can all create intellectual property, right? Like this image is intellectual property. I don't know why I'm sort of inking all this nonsense. I'm like, this is me, again, wasting a huge amount of time talking. But yeah, we can make worthless intellectual property. I would hope the goal of making your own IP or IP or whatever you want to call it is that we're making our own good intellectual property, right? Obviously. It might be cool if this was, I'm kind of not quite sure whether I want this to be like a vignette or not. Now that's what I'm still kind of thinking of. What actually is this going to be? And I'm like, probably I could. I mean, it would be fun to just try and maybe clean up this drawing, and then this would be a completely different process. But it might be cool to try and just clean up this and then see sort of where it went. Boom. But I think we've got time to do a finish line pass. So yeah, the goal is obviously to create valuable intellectual property, right? Like something that is going to stand the test of time, something that we're hoping we're going to be able to sell or develop or use for ourselves one day. And the other thing is, once you get into production on a lot of large video games, you understand the value of this. Like if you actually do have like a really nicely developed world that kind of makes sense, you can easily see if you work on these projects like how valuable that is if that did actually fit the type of world that you were trying to create, right? It solves so many problems. There's so much time wasted developing and making sure that lore does fit whatever project you're making to do all the developmental work. And if you kind of have it there, it does actually save quite a bit of time. So I think it is a good idea to consider building IP, building your own worlds, and then, you know, maybe at some point they will kind of have more value. The other thing is to look at, obviously, that much of the work that we see these days is actually adapted. So if you can sort of manifest this into something, then it's very easy for that to become sort of purchased and, you know, become valuable, right, over time. So anyway, it's a good idea, right? But lore, world building, IP supports an actual manifestation of that lore. Without that, it is worthless, right? And no one cares at all. So you can see this when, you know, you have existing lore, you have existing IP, and it is misused and people don't like it, right? Again, it doesn't really matter how good the lore is. If you don't like this manifestation of Star Trek or Warhammer or Star Wars or whatever, it doesn't matter how good you know the lore was, right? We don't like it. So the important thing is not actually the lore, it's not actually the IP, it's the way that it's used. So when we're thinking about you creating lore and creating IP, and maybe you're thinking about this is certainly the kind of thing that I think about. I would say like part of my job these days, like one of the main things I sort of get paid to do at the moment is actually to keep lore and to develop lore and to think about story and narrative structures for video games and how the lore kind of connects up with that. So this is something I actually do, right? Like I'm a professional lore keeper in the video game industry, and I spend all day thinking about exactly what I'm sort of talking about. So we're thinking about it from a different application, but I do have a pretty good understanding of like how these things tend to apply to an actual project for what it's worth. So let's look at a couple of examples here, because I think the real thing we need to think about, and I guess the TLDR, is that we need to make sure that the world we're building is there to support a very particular thing. And I'm going to really try and make the point for that And if you find this concept interesting, again, let me know. Let me know what you think. If you disagree, if you're like, dude, I don't know what you're talking about, that's not clear, or I do understand, and that's doesn't make any sense, like, just let me know in the comments. I'd be more than happy to kind of make a few sort of follow-up videos, maybe sort of laying it out more. But again, here we're just sort of chatting about it. So yeah, totally let me know what you think. I'm super keen to hear your ideas and thoughts here as well. So let's give a look at a couple of examples here of like how I think this manifests, because it's not always obvious, right? Because often we like things, you know, you like an RPG, you like a particular art style, you like a particular type of video game, you like a particular type of story or narrative, and we kind of often just sort of build the same thing, right? We're often just repeating or copying and replicating and duplicating the IP of our favorite IPs. And it's just important to understand that the utility value of that is probably going to be limited to a similar product. So if we look at, again, 3 examples here that I think are good to use. If you've got any others you'd like me to sort of break down, let me know. But yeah, Warhammer or Warhammer 40K. We've got Star Wars or Star Trek. So if we look at the concept of Warhammer, Warhammer is something, and especially 40K, is something where there is a massive amount of lore, right? It's really fun, the amount of lore that there's there. I am not, you know, a 40K acolyte. I know almost next to nothing. I think I played 5 hours of the Space Marine game before I got stuck, and then I kind of quit. That's typically how I will kind of do this these days, right? I don't have heaps of time to play video games. I never played the miniatures. I bought a Warhammer Fantasy miniature thing, and I thought this would be good, but I just don't have patience, right? I'm just not someone who can make those models and paint those things. I love the idea. It's just not for me. So I have really no idea about this, but I do know from looking at a lot of the stuff that comes out, a lot of game reviews, a lot of people talking about this, that like 40K has an obscene amount of lore, and it has all of this ridiculous, like really kind of sort of dark and miserable and dystopian future. And it's important to understand that like that's really fun, but it does support a particular type of story. It does support a particular type of narrative. And it's obviously meant to support and create a world where it seems plausible that you would have these gigantic battles and that there kind of wouldn't be anything else in the lore, right? There's no speak of romance or anything like that, right? It's kind of like these warring factions sort of almost like genetically manufacturing soldiers, and you know, there's no it's just all about war. It's all about fighting. All of the lore exists to create this hellscape dystopian future where people are just in these endless chaotic epic wars. And that's it's a terrible idea for a science fiction. It doesn't make much sense from a science fiction standpoint, but it's a perfect setup for why do I have these guys fighting in these battles all day, every day? And kind of why is there not as much of a narrative, right? Like why is this not about some hero? Or, you know, there are heroes, there are characters, I understand in the lore, but like there is a very transactional nature to it, right? And that is represented in the lore, that you just have these like epic battles. There's millions of people fighting, and that, you know, a lot of the armies and things are, you know, very horrific, right? And it's sort of gross and extreme. And anyway, it just kind of puts you in the mood for having this giant battle, right? That there's no thinking about like, oh, what are the societal ramifications of me destroying this kind of orc army? It's just like, no, we don't do that here, right? It's just all about war. And you can see that when you take that lore and you have that kind of like interesting manifestation of it, that you kind of need to make video games that fit that. You need to make other products that fit that. You need to make movies that fit that. And it's very challenging, I think, often for people to kind of connect all those dots. All right, I think I've done enough kind of drawing here. Let's see if we can do some sort of finished lines. Otherwise, I think this will take forever. So again, we're probably about like half an hour in. We've done a little drawing. The goal would be to maybe spend another half an hour doing finished lines, half an hour doing color, and we'll see how we go. Let's have a go. So this is really obvious when I say it, but when you're creating your world, it's often less obvious. But the lore that you build and the IP you build is really only going to be suitable, ideally, for a singular output. Like, it's very unlikely that you would build IP that would really work without significant adaptation in a novel, a prose novel, or a movie, right? Like, even that is quite challenging. You're really talking about a different story, a different way of telling a story. Movies are about what people do. Books are about what people think. And if you understand the strengths and weaknesses of those mediums, you'll build very different story structures and very different magical scenarios and things that will either manifest in a way that someone can think about them or that someone will do, right? And it's very challenging to adapt between those mediums. And when people are really focused on it, you can see you can have Harry Potter novels, Harry Potter movies, they sort of translate pretty well. But often you lose a lot of the things that just don't make sense when it comes to a movie, right? Because they're like, we can't do that because you can't talk about this interesting thing of like, I'm thinking this and you're doing this and all that kind of stuff. It's a lot harder to like change point of view or any of that kind of stuff. So often what you find is like a good book will have magical structures, it will have backgrounds, it will have laws, it will have items, it will have story points, it will have plot points, it will have all of this stuff. The lore is supporting a particular medium that focuses around you potentially being in different people's minds, that you understand the theory of mind a lot better, you understand who knows what, and you're inside someone's head often, and we can't see things, but we can explain how they feel a lot better, whereas a movie allows us to do none of those, but it's really good at us seeing things. So the same way that video games exist, right? Often the structures and the weapons and all of the character designs exist for us to see them very easily, for us to press a button and to have some magical thing manifest within itself. So the way you build magical structures and sort of background and lore is very, very different depending on what your output is. And that, again, that should be pretty obvious, but let's look at a couple of other sort of examples where we can sort of see like Star Wars, right? So Star Wars is a good example of really the point of this, the point of the story is about like what is the role of sort of faith or magic or the feeling of spirituality or some kind of like humanity and all of the kind of more human aspects of ourselves. Like, what is the value of that in a hyper technologically advanced future, which is obviously something in the 60s and 70s that you would be really concerned about. So you have an interesting idea that is there to be brought out, right, by that story, by Luke Skywalker having to trust in the Force versus technology. And there's a lot of other structures in there about the world. The fact that like the future is old in Star Wars. And again, I'm just talking about A New Hope because that's where the lore was created. Let's see. I need a pencil tool here. Boom. Let's see. I think this is the one. So when I do the finish lines, I like the underdrawing to be very, very faint, right? So that when I draw these finished lines, I can really see very clearly the new lines that I'm creating. But anyway, back to Star Wars. So Star Wars is one of these things where the entire concept of, as I said, technology being old and us having to sort of deal with this kind of old technology, and also the concept of like the empire, right? Of these kind of structures of lacking humanity, right? Like this is a bit of sort of dystopian, this feeling that you have sort of Darth Vader and all these other characters that sort of representing and manifesting this feeling that like in the future, the technology is going to control people, right? And that the Empire and all these other characters are going to sort of be captured by the technology and these kind of tyrannical, political, militaristic structures, right? And like it's what's opposing that is this concept of the Force, of like an older tradition, of sort of magic, and of faith, right? And to me, that's kind of like fundamentally what it's about. Again, this is not based on me looking at anyone else's dissertations on Star Wars. This is just me kind of being like, this is what I see when I see the film. So the entire lore and everything is built to support that story in A New Hope, essentially. And it's because that is built up and you have those sort of natural tensions there, it allows that story to kind of play out well. And you can see that when you kind of align story structures with that world, you get sort of quite good results. You get sort of interesting results. When you're telling stories about that, then, typically interesting things happen. As soon as we sort of violate that, the logic of the story, the logic of the world kind of falls apart. It's just not as compelling to me anyway. And, I think it's like Star Wars is obviously really, really great intellectual property, has a lot of potential. There's a lot of things that people like about it, but fundamentally, like that is the lore that's built to support that story structure. Again, let me know what you think in the comments down below, but that's kind of how I really sort of see that playing out. And I think often what happens is like we focus on designing the aliens and the spaceships, and we focus on all of that kind of stuff. And while that's important, it's important to understand that the more successful ships and things are there to really represent that idea of the lore. And so the designs and everything is not just a matter of like cool shapes and like, oh, this is interesting and this is good. It's that the technology and the different concepts there are meant to represent and help people understand that concept. So for instance, you have a lightsaber, which is something that we would understand as being an older technology, right? Like it represents an honor and which again is probably not the case, but an imagined fantasy of a time where people had honor, right? And it wasn't just a matter of sort of mindlessly shooting each other, but people faced each other in battle, right? There is this kind of fantasy that people have there, and that's something that is connected with by people watching that film. And the same thing if we look at one of the most popular sort of ships. This is one of my main I often sort of teach this point when it comes to sort of lore and story and science fiction. Probably the most sort of famous ship in Star Wars is the Millennium Falcon. And the Millennium Falcon embodies exactly this story and thematic idea that I was talking about. So if we think about the way that theme or a general kind of overriding concept plays out within a film, you can look at the Millennium Falcon and it is talking about the same thing. The Millennium Falcon is old, right? It doesn't work. And it requires like a certain level of kind of faith and interaction with it. So it's talking about the unreliability of technology. But, the fact that, when technology has kind of personality, it's more appealing, it's more interesting. And it also brings out a lot of the story concepts. It helps to really bring out, and I think it's one of the main things that helps to draw out most character interaction within A New Hope, for instance, which is where the lore is designed, right? The lore of the Millennium Falcon, the design of it, all that kind of stuff is really designed to bring out the story of A New Hope. It just kind of ends up being in a whole bunch of other stories for, with far less impact. But it's helping to frame the way that different people view the concept of technology, the way that people view the act of this concept of the Force, or the concept of whether or not something needs to be new to be good, right? So the Millennium Falcon is old. It's in the future, but it's old and a bit junk, right? And I think this is, again, central to that concept of like technology, the future, and whether or not that has value versus like swords, faith, and people, right? Versus the Death Star is a manifestation of like this just giant amount of technology that is purely existing to destroy. And it works, right? Like it is functional and it's sort of systemized. Anyway, there's a lot of these things where we don't have to kind of keep keep sort of drilling home that point. But yeah, there's so many of these basic ideas I think that we kind of miss when we're just thinking about like, I need to design a cool ship. Millennium Falcon is a ship. Millennium Falcon is one of the best designs ever, but the reason I think that people connect with it is because it is central to the story of A New Hope. It's central to the thematic structure of A New Hope. And it's also connecting the future with something that we have a lot of relationship to, which is the fact that like our cars break down, you know, and you always know, it helps people to understand like that, you know, a guy who has like a really fast car that they think is really good, but it's always breaking down. And that's Han Solo. So it's like the technology, the lore, the design, the things we're doing as world building. When it's done well, it's all really helping to support the structure of an important story that people can connect to on a human level. And when we kind of miss that, it kind of just all falls flat. So again, I could probably talk about this for an infinity, because I just think this is Star Wars, and the success of Star Wars and some of these concepts is just endlessly fascinating. But you can see how that sort of story structure and that lore and that technology and that world building is kind of really there to support that story, versus Warhammer 40k, which is there to support none of that. Right? It's like none of that is there. It's about completely different things, and that is the value of the intellectual property and the way that the things that you're going to create are going to be able to have an emotional impact on people. So if we think about Star Trek, right? Star Trek, again, is slightly different. This is something which is really talking about, I guess, the nature, and this is to me anyway, I'm not a huge Star Trek nerd or anything like that, but often this is talking about the nobility of the human race, right? And like what it means to be human in this kind of sea of aliens. And like, again, like similar kind of concept, I guess, like similar milieu, but it really is talking about like what role and what place would humanity have in a highly technological future, where a lot of our humanity may not actually be valuable. But what we do is we create races like Spock, right? You have your sort of Vulcans, you have these sort of different technological aspects that actually manifest and represent different aspects of humanity. And it's through interacting with those that we get to bring out like maybe what is still valuable about humanity in a technological future that is highly advanced. And you also have concepts like the Borg that get introduced in Star Trek that, again, help us to explore the main theme or the main thing that entire intellectual property is about. What you tend to find is that when we veer from that basic idea, the lore doesn't support that well, right? The character interactions that would be natural aren't supported that well. And again, they often find like interesting ways around it, right? Like a lot of the TV shows, veer much more into sort of like sort of soap opera, right? They're not often dealing with these kind of larger sort of questions. But yeah, you tend to find that when we sort of hit these main lore points, and that the lore is there to support these concepts, that sort of everything works pretty well. But again, we're looking at the way that humanity's emotion and its sort of lack of logic, and maybe our sort of the barbarism that we see as being counteracted by technology, right? And the way that often our humanity doesn't fit with technology, and this dispassionate sort of view of the world and science and all that kind of stuff, is that, is there value to your James T. Kirk or whatever his name is, right? Right? Like, is there still value to that guy, right? Who is just going to trust his gut? And I think, again, this is like endlessly fascinating because it relates to everyone's story. And what you find is, if you look at a lot of Star Wars, like, a lot of it is supporting that. The different races are there to support that central question. That question is often one of the things that keeps getting brought up. How would slightly changing the temperament or the attitude of different alien races affect things? And I think, that's sort of endlessly fascinating. And the core idea there is like, it's kind of interesting, but it's only interesting when you really find properties and ways of expressing that are good. And when we're not, again, that's where everyone's like, I didn't like it, right? It didn't work for me. Now, again, there's no sort of magical formula here where, like, obviously, if you just do this, it kind of, everything works out. Like, there is a magic to getting these things to work. But if we think about, like, what can we do to put our best foot forward as artists, sort of trying to put our foot into this world of, like, creating IP, I think often what happens is we just end up designing monsters for no reason. There's no inherent logic behind the world. We don't have an output for it. We're just building IP. And I think the sad thing is that often that's just not really going to go anywhere. You need to build a lot of those things to support a particular type of structure. The IP actually kind of needs to stand for something. You need to have an idea here, and the different types of worlds that you would build, the different type of lore you would build to create, like, a video game versus a novel versus a movie, would be a little bit different. And it's very challenging to kind of mix them, because often they have different utilities and different things that they kind of need. So, this is, again, it's one of these things that I just think is super interesting. We could probably talk about that for a million years, but think about, if you want sort of a final sort of way to kind of think about this, like, think about how your story or your game or your movie or your book or your comic, or like whatever it is that you're making, like whatever it is, the story that you're creating, whatever the manifestation of your lore, like, ideally that story kind of couldn't happen in another world, right? It couldn't happen somewhere else. And this is often the delineation between science fiction and space opera. And really often, Star Wars and Star Trek often are space opera, right? That there's often not a lot of actual science there. It's really exploring humanity and, a lot of these other kind of more soft science fiction concepts. But still, I think the idea holds that probably the story of Star Wars, right, sort of couldn't happen anywhere else, right? You need that mix of technology and magic and space wizardry to kind of really draw out the main point of that. But, it is very much a story that, could just happen anywhere. But think as much as possible about, like, how can you create lore or intellectual property or whatever you want to call it? How can you create it so that that is going to create, in turn, opportunities for a particular thing to happen that could only happen in this world? This is where I think the IP often has its actual value, is it kind of creates a scenario where, because this is such a well-developed world and it really lends itself to, like another example would be something like Monster Hunter, right? Like, what's Monster Hunter about? It's about hunting monsters, right? The entire lore, most of what you develop, is really geared around hunting different monsters, building armor out of those monsters, all that kind of stuff. Like, this stuff is obvious, but I think often what happens is if you're thinking about just randomly building IP, you really need to think about, like, what is this for? Is it for a monster hunting game? Is it for a narrative game? Is it for an adventure game? Is it for a mystery? Is it for a novel? Is it for, obviously it's probably not going to be for a novel, but, what are we sort of building this for? And I think the more you can kind of get at that, the more you're going to be able to create scenarios and ideas and concepts that really only are going to work within that particular world. So yeah, I think like that's the main sort of series of talking points that I was just going to sort of go over there. And I'm really interested to, hear kind of what you have to say on that. If you've got any sort of ideas, just certainly like drop a comment down below. Because yeah, it's always interesting for me to kind of see where other people come from, because a lot of people again have like a lot of experience. We often have experience kind of watching movies and playing games and doing all that. So there's often really interesting insights you can have about what you do like. But it's very challenging to actually go and do that yourself, right? To actually start doing the thing. Because often, again, we trip up. What I found is that like a lot of people, boom, there we go. Yeah, a lot of people really trip up when it comes to building these kind of things and thinking about the world that you're trying to create, thinking about what you're doing, and yeah, like not being able to edit and make decisions. And I think the key is that often what we're trying to do is we're sort of trying to edit and make decisions based on that big thematic idea, right? Like the things that get left in are things that are going to really support and help us to tell the story that we want to tell. I'm just going to make a smaller version of this so I can keep checking it on a different monitor. Window, arrange, new window for this, and I will drag it up here. Oh, over here. Boom. So we can see it there. Yeah, so we often have like really good ideas about what works, but when it comes to actually doing this for ourselves, what I found is like a lot of people really kind of struggle to figure out like how do I figure this out, right? And I think it's because often the editing process, right, like what gets left in, what gets left out, all this stuff is often drastically influenced by the actual thing you're doing with it. Right? Like the ship that gets picked, the ideas that get picked, the things that get selected from a concept design perspective are often like intrinsically linked to the purpose of the product. And that is just one of these natural things that I think often creates very interesting restrictions that in turn creates very interesting lore. So yeah, always just think about this. Like, what is the actual purpose of the IP that I'm building? Am I just kind of randomly kind of making things? And I think, yeah, there's no harm in trying to do this, right? And trying to make sort of IP and sort of build it before. But yeah, I really think often in the beginning, what we're trying to do is like not make any decisions. We're trying to be like, no, I want this to sort of be used for anything. Like this could be for a movie, it could be for a game, it could be for this, it could be that. And I think the reality is that kind of doesn't work that well. But I do think that the concept of building your own thing is a really good idea, and it's something we should all be doing more of as artists. So yeah, let me, now I'm gonna keep sort of finishing this. Boom. And yeah, I think it's also really important to distinguish for yourself, like when you are making art, what is the purpose? Like, are you world building? Because often when we're building worlds and we're thinking about ideas, it really is a matter of spending most of our time really thinking about and considering exactly what I was just talking about. Like, what is the purpose here? Like, what is going on? And when you're just trying to make something look pretty, then that is like a very sort of different idea. All right, it's a very different sort of set of things that you're going to do. And when I'm doing this, again, I'm just working illustration skills. I'm just working storytelling skills, whatever it may be. And yeah, really the value also of like building specific artistic processes to support this, like building things when You want to be world building, you want to be doing concept design, like having artistic structures that support that mean you don't get sucked into doing illustration when you should be thinking about things and developing ideas. Because yeah, the other thing that you can kind of see that hopefully should be fairly obvious if we consider this is like, this is often not in the beginning about just creating pretty pictures. And I think often what we do as artists is we just create pretty pictures, right? We just sort of sit there going, oh, hey, you know, I create pretty pictures for other people's ideas. Like, let's just make pretty pictures for me. And yeah, you know, like that is probably just not going to work that well, because it is the ideas and the actual intellectual property behind it that it's going to make a difference. And the reason for this is, right, like this is probably also something that's worth sort of going into, is that, you know, it's so easy these days, if all we're building when it comes to IP is just an aesthetic, right, or like a few designs, that the reality is like that's not really intellectual property. It's so easy for someone to just take, you know, your cool sort of world building project from ArtStation or whatever and just kind of say, just copy this, the look of this, right? It's not actually that valuable to have an aesthetic, because an aesthetic is not intellectual property. It's not copyrightable unless you have manifested it into something, like unless you were trying to create something that is well known, that looks like the Millennium Falcon. Then again, you're sort of violating someone's existing intellectual property, because that is actually intellectual property, because you may actually be taking money from them. It's only when it's valuable that it becomes defendable and valuable, right? In the beginning, the things that are valuable are not the aesthetic, right? It's just so important to understand that, right? The aesthetic is essentially all you're doing by putting it online is just sort of giving it to, you know, whoever, whichever art director wants to kind of just put it on a mood board and pay someone else to create, right? Because, you know, there's plenty of concept artists who can just sort of be hired to ape a particular look, particular style. They're often very good at this. This is what we do all day, every day. So if all you've got is just a little kind of aesthetic or a cool feeling or something, it's like, it's so easy to rip that stuff off. And there's no legal recourse or anything really to that, because style is not copyrightable, and often, you know, an aesthetic, unless it's already existing, you know, and then even so, like, I think that would be highly problematic, I would assume, from a legal perspective. Yeah, it's kind of just not worth anything, right? It's kind of just, it's just art. So I think, again, the thing that makes it more intellectual property is there being some high concept or some idea that kind of really links it together. And what that means is having and making sure your ideas could only happen within that world, or having a genuine high concept idea that, you know, sounds like an elevator pitch, right? Like something where, you know, if you say it, everyone understands. And then they're like, oh, what would that look like? Oh, here's what that would look like. Okay, cool. Now we're off to the races, right? Like now we're getting somewhere, right? Like now we actually may have something. And again, people may be able to ape that, but, you know, it may just be cheaper and easier to get someone who's already sort of figured that out. So I think that's something that's really worth considering, right? Is understanding that aesthetic, especially with AI, but even before AI, quite frankly, was quite cheap and easy to replicate, and not a good basis for intellectual property, as far as I can see. But yeah, there certainly are lots of other sort of things that might be valuable. So it's like high concept ideas are better. High concept ideas that are already visually fleshed out, I think, are more sort of valuable. Something that exists within, you know, existing kind of IP is good. This is why so many people have sort of turned to making comics instead of sort of movie pictures, because it means that, you know, the intellectual property has actually been used and it's a lot more defendable. And also you've kind of proven that hopefully it actually has an audience, right? You've done the work to actually figure out what the end of the story is. And again, that also is worth a lot more. So as I said, yeah, let me know if that kind of tracks, whether that sort of makes sense. Again, I don't think there's anything wrong just kind of doing world building exercises for fun, but the reality is that I think if you just make a few tweaks to this, it can often make a huge amount of difference, and you're basically just doing the same thing. Boom. Boom. So yeah, not entirely sold on. I feel like some of these proportions might be a little bit off still. I feel like this arm is like a bit, it's too big. So again, there's a million ways you could kind of futz that. Sometimes it can just be a matter of like shifting it up, right? Or just erase that. Join those up. It's a bit rough, but I find that this will kind of often work well enough. And probably kind of move that up a little bit. That might be good too. So yeah, the importance of, for illustration, we'll just go back to some of the process stuff here. The importance of like having your own process for doing this, and the same thing, like your process for, if you are thinking of doing world building, your process for coming up with those ideas, with thinking about what to do first, what to do second, how to develop it, how to, work your sort of brainstorming. Having like a good process for that, like knowing where you are in that process, is really important. I think that the real key to process, and one of the things I'm often teaching, is that if you kind of know where you are in a series of steps, it makes what you're doing so much easier. If we think about, for instance, the theory of like doing thumbnails, one of the things I'm often talking about is to do 20, right? Like do a huge chunk, a huge number of thumbnails, and make sure that you kind of take the pressure off this idea of like, what I'm drawing now is not perfect. And this is the same for world building, right? Like knowing whether your job is to create the prettiest picture or the best idea, or whether what you're doing as a designer is to try and connect up the ideas that you have in your lore that you're building, or your stories that you're building. The importance of like connecting that up with the actual kind of visuals and the actual maybe sort of gameplay or story that you're thinking of is so important. And I think it's, as the more you can just kind of have a good, reliable process for doing this, the easier your life will be. It just means that you kind of know like, hey, I'm doing this thing. Like this is the stage that I'm at. It's okay that this is rough, or in this case, like it's okay that it's rough, but it's not okay if the illustrative quality of it is lacking, right? Like that's the thing that I'm trying to kind of develop. So I need to make sure that that is at least good, or at least that's how I'm going to sort of judge the success of it. And I think often what happens is we will be doing some exercise like, hey, I'm going to design my own characters, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And, often as designers, we're often just wanting to make things look pretty. We so rarely do. And then often when I think this certainly happens for me often, when I go to design my own characters, I'm just kind of like, oh, this looks pretty, right? Like finally I'm able to kind of do what I want, which is just, make these kind of cool shots. And we miss the actual building of ideas and the functionality of it, the purpose of it. And it means that, you're often, for me anyway, what happens is, as soon as the drawing doesn't look good, I'm like, oh, this is a failure, right? Because it looks sort of ugly. But if I was looking at the process I should use, or if I was looking at the process that, would be something that I would use in a professional environment, that's where I'd be much more considering not whether it looks pretty, but like, does it fit the brief, right? Like, does it help me? You know, is this actually working? I'm not sure what should be happening with these hands. I'm like, is this hand too small? Not quite sure. Try and add a little bit of stuff to it, this arm. It's a little bit lame, a little bit boring. All right. So again, I'm just trying to, I feel like the pose is a little bit kind of funny. I think it kind of makes sense to me that she sort of has this leg dipped down. I feel like, yeah, it's like, it's not 100% from an anatomical point of view. Right, sort of got this hip here. Yeah, not entirely sure how that is gonna sort of play out. Boom. All right. Probably need to give that up. I don't like, if it's not happening now, it's probably not going to happen. And yeah, I think I'm overdue to get this finished from a line work perspective and keep going. Boom. So one of the things that I often do as part of the sort of simple, reliable process that I teach, even though we're doing things that are really basic from a drawing perspective, what I am going to try and do is just separate things into, like, let's draw the character on its own layer and let's draw the background on its own layer. So I think I've pretty much got the character done. Let's do these quickly. Don't have much time for this. Boom, boom, boom. All right, and let's put in this shading, or I guess non-linear hatching. Just kind of organic textural passes here on the shadow. Boom. Boom. All right, I think that is enough. All right, so next I am going to draw the background. So let's make one layer here, and I don't have much time for this, so we'll just do this quickly. Boom, boom, boom. See if we can think of adding some quick texture. And again, we certainly could put like some of this stuff on a separate background layer, right? It might be good to think about where the overlaps are going to be. Having some sort of plants climbing up here. Got some kind of moss or something like that growing on the top. I think often one of the reasons a lot of the backgrounds that I'm doing look the same is I wish running out of time, because they're not going to be the thing that really kind of, I think, saves or makes the illustration that much better. because it's mostly character based. Boom. See if we can get a few more of these hanging down bits here. All right. And with part of this line work, again, now that I've sort of, I have most of the structure done, I've kind of got most of this main character done, a lot of what I'm doing here is pretty suggestive, right? I'm trying not to complete a lot of these lines. Just make sure it's on the right layer. Yeah. So we've sort of got some lily pads or some type of water-borne plant that's kind of maybe climbing up here. And yeah, let's see if I can just quickly do this. Often one of the things I like to use as a specific process tool, although it doesn't often seem like that, is to kind of go, look, if I had 5 minutes to finish this, like what would I do? Right? If I had 5 minutes to do the background, right? Like what would I do? What would something be that kind of would really help this? Boom. And then once that's done, yeah, it's often surprising. If you just ask the right question, again, often you get an interesting answer. So some of these are going to be like water. Boom. All right, that's probably enough. Probably running out of time, right? If it's not happening yet, it's probably not going to happen. Oh, a few more. And think about some here. All right, we sort of got a bit of also some shadow under here. Boom, 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 boom. Again, it's very like, I'm indicating texture, I'm indicating shadow. It's very symbolic, right? Like nothing here is super realistic. But yeah, we'll see. I think this will probably be enough to create something interesting. I'm still not sure. And sometimes I leave these things up as an experimentation, like not quite sure how it's going to go, but I'm kind of thinking like maybe this whole thing could kind of work as a vignette. I'm not sure about that. Again, so this is a bit too much, like there's a bit too much closed sort of finished lines here. I feel like that's a bit awkward. And these are the things where I'm like, should I? It's probably not going to matter. But at the same time, it totally does matter. Anyway, I'm going to give up. Cool. All right. Let's look at flat color. Let's see how this works out. Again, she's got that sort of crazy eye sort of thing. Often can be good to just get rid of those lines, the sketch lines, and see what we've got. We can flip it one final time, right? See if it kind of makes sense. And often, yeah, I think it's good to have just like very simple stage where you can, if you need, right, just go through and add some final kind of touches, right? It's often just a few little bits and pieces here and there can really kind of anchor a drawing, make it seem a little bit more polished. Uh-oh, I'm doing it on the wrong layer. Let's get rid of that, have another go. Wrong layer. Control Shift J, let's move it up. Control E to merge it down. There we go. All right, now let's keep working on this. So yeah, it's often just a matter of like where we got our focal areas, right? We can just emphasize those lines a little bit more. It's not always a matter of like, you know, closing the lines or anything like sometimes, again, it might be good here to kind of have her neck be in shadow a little bit, considering I've got shadow elsewhere. And one of the things is like, I'm probably going to give her like a big sort of lip there, but I'm probably going to do it mostly in the color. So yeah, but often one of the things I find really interesting is like if you watch the Naoki Urasawa's Man Ben documentary, the amount they kind of talk about finessing the lines of the face, right? The little kind of like eyes, and just making sure like some of these little areas are just feel like they've got a little bit extra special sauce on them. And I've sort of tried to take that on board, right? Like everything can kind of be a bit rough, but sometimes you just want to take the face, right, and just kind of finesse it a little bit more, because that can often make the difference. I'm not convinced of this nose. Let's see. All right, that might be a little bit better. Right, also maybe a bit of extra stuff there. So again, in color, we'll have this, and that'll drastically change the feeling and the proportion of this of the face, but I don't want to draw that line in. We'll see how we go though, because yeah, you never know. All right, what are we doing? Let's hide that. Let's hide this. Got my wand, and I'm using this. This is also Photoshop, and you can do this. You can actually do very similar things to this in obviously Clip Studio and also in Procreate. There are ways to kind of speed up some of this flatting work. Not quite as easy as it is in Photoshop, but yeah, you can sort of do it. So again, I forget which action is which. Let's see. I think it's this one. Boom. Yep. All right. Boom. So I got that. Now let's do this one. I think this is flipped the wrong way, but that's all right. Okay. So I'm just going to very roughly join this stuff up. Oh. Join this up. Almost. Yeah, there's obviously a huge amount of stuff here. It's not connected up. It's all a bit rough. Boom. Not too bad. All right. Another action. And I am going to, I feel like I've been asked and I've been promised a million times to, and I have promised a million times to explain exactly how those actions work and sort of go through that kind of stuff, but I haven't been able to do it yet. Let's put those lines away. Boom. Put the signature back. Okay, and now probably I will be moving this up here. And again, sometimes with these, again, you can always leave it flipped. Like I feel like leaving it flipped this way is like actually kind of works pretty well. I think that kind of works okay, but yeah, I might decide at the last minute to kind of leave it like this. I just feel like it's a little bit more dynamic. Maybe not the best. Again, it's sort of running off the page, but yeah. In which case we can just flip the, right? Flip this, put this up here or down here or something like that. I might actually do that. So I'm going to start with a gradient. I'm going to go see if we can just see what works. Thinking something kind of like that. Control U. See if we can tweak the colors a little bit. So again, what color scheme? The other thing on the channel, if you haven't seen it already, is like some very simple advice on color schemes and things that, you know, might sort of work there. I am going to see if I can use that. So basically, I'm going with a harmonious color scheme, right? So thinking about, oh, come on. Oh. Control U, sorry, I was in the wrong spot. Yeah, so thinking about some blues, some greens, and then we'll see what. Let's see if we can make this sort of more saturated. Yeah, that feels boom, right? Cool. So now I'm going to go back to basically using, so I was using this pencil inking thing, which is the same thing you can get in the Line and Color Quick Start Guide. If you want to sort of check that out, download that. Most of the brushes I'm going to be using here, I think all of them are going to be in that. But that one for sure is there, the one I used to do the actual kind of lines with, right? Like that's there. And the other one I'm using is it is the simplest, roughest, dirtiest brush you could ever use, which is the, as I said, same one I did the drawing with. The pencil tool. Right, boom, 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 boom. And the goal here is to try and make this look good, mostly thinking about using ideas related to illustration. So I'm not going to try and make this look really fancy in terms of the rendering or anything like that. I'm mostly going to try and make it work in terms of composition, in terms of getting the 1, 2, 3 read right. So I'm limiting myself to really simple kind of flat colors. And I'm just going to see if I can just make it look sort of a little bit interesting. So I'm using this, which I'm sort of hoping might be able to help me with my 1, 2, 3 read. And 1, 2, 3 read is also something that people have sort of asked about before, like what am I talking about? This just means like, where am I going to look first? Like what is my hierarchy of story, right? Like what is the story I'm telling? What's the first thing that I want people to look at? And it's just a matter of directing the eye, basically. So I'm just still using I've got it set to low opacity, but I'm still just using here the pencil tool with a round brush pencil tool. And yeah, seeing whether that will sort of help. Just adding a little bit of something to the background so it feels as if there's something there. But the main idea, I guess, is that, you know, we're sort of looking at some kind of swamp where it's sort of faded out over here. So we could, right, again, draw some sort of shape. So I'm just doing these on new layers, super low opacity, and just sort of drawing, right, drawing some shapes here. And this really is just to frame the composition. And in most cases, I'm just doing this completely intuitively, right? So there's not a lot of thinking about the composition. I'm just trying to engage intuition. But if we were to apply some sort of informal compositional rules, things like, again, you might see these ideas referenced in something like Andrew Loomis's creative illustration. We could sort of think about how these shapes that I'm creating here are going to sort of help me support via creating sort of lines, right? So for instance, one of the things we could kind of think about is like, I want her head to kind of pop out above that kind of tree line in the back. And I'm thinking that might be sort of useful to have happen. All right, so the other thing I'm doing here from a color theory perspective is I'm kind of just using one color, right? So we're using basically just harmonious colors. I've sort of got greens, gray greens. I've got this sort of yellowy green in the background here, right? So if we sort of look at these on the color wheel, right, they're kind of going like boom around here, right? Just up there. So that's a harmonious color scheme. Now, I might add a complement, right? And the complement would be kind of here, like this sort of pinky color. But I'm going to make most of the image just have this kind of mud, right? So again, we're going to sort of add this. And you can see that Control U, right? If I make this a little bit darker, you can see that, you know, in most cases, like that's still a fairly sort of strong image, right? If I sort of zoom out, right, it works on a tonal perspective, and that might be something where like that's all I need. But it might also be good to play around with, like, could we add some kind of complement? And there's a couple of different ways we could do this. We could make her sort of cloak have this kind of pinky sort of color that's opposite the color wheel. So often when I'm doing this, you know, I'll just play around, you know, I'll just roughly in the beginning sort of put a few colors down on a separate layer. And I'm using some sense of color theory, but I'm also just trying to be a little bit intuitive, right? Like if I sort of did that, would that be interesting? I'm not sure. Well, let's leave that there. Let's also think about, like, one of the other things I could do is make her, this is something I often find fun, is sort of, we could maybe make her sort of skin color more red, right? And in the beginning, because I'm not quite sure like how detailed I want this to be, or like whether or not this is actually the final, I'm just going to kind of rough it in. And what I'll do is I'll go in later if I do decide to go with this color, and I'll sort of refine it. But for the moment, right, we're just being pretty rough. Well, let's put it over there so it's a bit easier to see. Boom, boom. And the good thing with this like really basic technique that I'm using, which is like it's on a different layer, is that as soon as I've kind of roughed it in, I'm going to be able to change it very easily. Right, boom, boom. And because I'm using the theory that I'm using, and this is very simple, this is very similar to the basic ideas I teach when it comes to line and color illustration. Or there's actually a video I did on this, which is like, I think it's like this color scheme always works, or something like that on the channel that you can kind of look at. And it's talking about a very similar idea, which is I'm just mostly relying on and keeping the mud there. I'm keeping the gray tones, the harmonious kind of colors that aren't going to stick out. And then I'm looking for what's that primary or secondary read that's really going to sort of pop off the page. And again, you know, if I sort of zoom out, you can see like, does that work? Is that interesting? Now I can go Control U on here and I can see like, you know, look, will this help if I made it lighter, if I made it darker, or if we kind of change the color a bit, right? Like maybe it would be better to make it a little bit more sort of skin sort of color, like still very sort of pink, right? A bit sort of abstract. But yeah, like maybe that would be the way to go. And then probably underneath that, this is where I'd sort of play around with, like, could we, right? Like, could we, like, what colors do I have here? So I don't want to go, I want it to be harmonious. I'm not going to create anything sort of crazy, but I could create some blue hair. Again, I often like this kind of combo, red skin, blue hair. Right, and we'll put that there. And once I kind of find the feeling or the color scheme that I like, so I'm painting underneath. You can see here's the skin, right? Oh, I think I've accidentally started just painting on here. That's fine. So just painting that skin color underneath. Sorry, the hair color underneath. Right, and then it's like, does that look interesting? I mean, I think that's, I don't know. I think it's interesting. Okay, I still got the cloak here. So let's go and say, let's make the cloak not that color, but maybe we could make it a different kind of blue, maybe a sort of a darker blue. It could be white. No, I mean, I think like something. Yeah, something like that. I just think this is I think I've used this as recently on a color scheme as well. I think it's like a fun. So we're using, I've got warm and cool contrast, obviously. We've got the sort of the pink. I'm using slightly grayer tones in the background. And basically, like anywhere where I'm not going to have color or primary read, it's just going to be these kind of gray tones that are sort of in the background, right? And I think that's a really important thing to always just sort of get straight, is like you don't always have to pick. I don't always have to go through with these things and say, that, you know, I have to make this leather color or this color, right? Like it really is very fantastical what we're sort of doing here. Yeah, so often what I'm going to do is just kind of rough in a bunch of colors. So she's basically sort of wearing a blue color. Now, because I have primary read here, I mean, another thing that I would do is kind of say, well, we do have, firstly, let's put in some eye color, because I think that's important. And the basic idea here, right, I guess the point that I'm sort of making with teaching and talking about simple, reliable color processes and stuff like that is that, like, if we sit here thinking about what the color scheme should be, so here we've got these big sort of lips that I didn't want to put in before. Boom. Right, if I sort of sit here thinking about, see if I can put some of those sort of teeth there. Yeah, if I sort of sit here thinking about carefully like what color goes where, and if the only tool I have to really kind of consider is just color, then I'm going to learn more about what color works, right? And here's another sort of opportunity again to go, all right, and kind of say, well, where's my primary read? I want my primary read up here. Let's go with that. Boom. 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 All right, so now I'm like, let's see if we can clean this up. Let's see if this kind of works. So we're going to have the little accent colors to be like that. Yeah. What else do we need? Let's see. Again, I probably want, oh, get this sword happening. Boom, and let's see if we can get a slightly lighter color here. Boom, for this sort of metal color. Right, and this, maybe we could see if we can make this, all right, like slightly, can we make this slightly warmer? these things, right? Let's get, I don't know why, but like it feels to me like maybe, oh, yeah, let's just start over the top. So now I'm like, I've kind of got it based, I've kind of got it blocked in. This is a very rough way of doing it. It's not the most sort of clean or professional way, but I like to emphasize the concept of experimentation with these color schemes. So this way, if I kind of block it in, right, what are we at? We're like almost sort of 2 hours here with this thing, boom, which is a little bit long, but we're pretty much done, right? And what happens is, like, if I kind of can't be bothered putting in any of these little details, like the image is still going to work. So basically now I kind of have a set amount of time that I can use to really go in there and say, okay, let's see if we can clean this up, right? Let's make this less rough, right? Less awful. Right, go in here. Right, I'm just cleaning up. And all I've done is just created a new layer over the top of everything else. So this means that now I can no longer mess around with those previous layers, right? So I'm not going to be able to change the color of the cape just yet, because I've kind of started painting over that sort of initial layer mess that I made. What I'm doing now is just going over the top of everything and just kind of refining that color scheme that I've sort of roughed in. But the reason for this is we're looking at a 10-minute or 5-minute process in a half an hour sort of coloring process. This is not a comic book. It's just sort of rough illustration. It doesn't matter if it kind of doesn't end up looking super polished. I'm not going to put any shading in here. So it's basically like this is done. And it's just a matter of me sort of going in there, cleaning it up, and seeing how much refinement we can put in it. And yeah, I'm going to focus on the face. Right, let's see if we can put a more blushed kind of tone in the ears. Let's clean up anything that is in our primary read, right? Like where is in is kind of in the focal area, right? Like her face is sort of in the focal area. So let's clean that up. Let's make sure we don't have anything sort of too messy there. But everything else can kind of live its life, right? So here, I think it's going to be a lot easier for me to just go through and do those again. Now, there's much more clean ways of doing this. So one of the things I could do is sort of flat everything in the beginning in a very clean way. And if I had maybe an hour to do this, that's what I would do. And I think the concept that I always like to think about when it comes to sort of developing what I like to call perfect process for yourself is to really understand like what processes are going to support a particular level of quality for whatever you're doing. And if you really understand that, if you can really dial in for yourself like what you need to do and have good expectations about, okay, I need to get this done in half an hour. What's the technique? Okay, I need to get this done and have more detail in there. And I've got 2 hours. Like, what is the technique for coloring? Knowing those things for you and how you're going to change your sort of like subtle tactics, I think is really, really important. But let's look at, again, how we can move this forward a little bit. One of the things I think would be cool to do would be to, I want the inside of this cape to be slightly darker. So I'm actually going to basically just merge Control E, or let's just Control E on all those. We merge them down. So now I basically just have this flat thing. Now I can select, if I turn off contiguous, can go boom and select all of that color. Now Control H to hide it. And what I'm going to do is just see if I can select a slightly different color for the shadow. And this will just give, again, this is one of these things where probably not necessary, but on an illustration, like sometimes if this was a comic page and I had 100 of these, I wouldn't put this kind of shadow color being different. But on an illustration like this, I find this can often make quite a bit of difference. In the same way, we could do that with this, right? Just put a little bit. Right, a little bit of a slightly different color here. Boom. So yeah, super simple process, super easy, super basic, nothing fancy. You can basically do these same steps in any kind of program. And you can see down here, it's still looking like a little bit rough down there, comparatively speaking. So this is where, yeah, you could definitely go in there and just sort of clean this up as well. Boom. Boom. And the other thing I could do is try and say, okay, let's see if we can, right, on a new layer, right, new layer, right, oh. Can I add a few little bits and pieces here to kind of make it clear that some of these leaves are just a little bit more green. Again, not sure whether this is really going to help, but we'll see. All right, and I think probably one of the things, yeah, that's sort of happening there. So this is kind of not covered up, so it's giving us some weird feelings. All right, so yeah, just clean that up. Make sure there's nothing really ugly going on. All right, boom, boom, clean, clean. And yeah, at any point, right, we could probably hit send on this and it would be, right, it would be fine. We're just sort of trying to make it a little bit more interesting. So, again, that is what it is. Now, again, the other thing I like to do is say, well, what about if I had, over here, what about if I had a little bit of time to do a few of those sort of final touches? So what I'd probably do is make a couple of extra layers, right? And we can also make a noise layer, which is something else I'm always going to do as part of the general kind of stylistic process I have. So we'll set that to 50. New layer, set it to 50% gray. Boom, let's set it to overlay. Now it disappears because that's what happens with 50% gray and overlay. And now filter, noise, add noise, and there we go. Now I'm going to, I'm going to grab that, Control J, which is going to duplicate that. And now what I'm going to do is make that bigger. So I have a combination of bigger noise and smaller noise, and I'm going to reduce the opacity of them. Right. Oh yeah, that does. I was like, did I make a mark? I think I did. Boom. Boom. Yeah. Right. So the problem is, again, like when you have really high res noise, you kind of get this really fine noise, and I want something a little bit in between. So just kind of mix them both. Again, making them both a lot more subtle, and we'll turn those on in a minute. All right. And the other thing we can do is right. See if we can add some sort of atmosphere to the background, right, to sort of fade this out. Again, now I'll sort of erase it. See if we can bring some of that forward. And again, it's going to be, you could also just do this with gradient again. Use something a bit lighter. All right. And we can also clip something to the character. And that way, I'm just going to run some of that atmosphere up, right? So taking the background color here, I'm going to make it a bit darker because this will create more of a silhouette, right? And maybe a little bit darker still. So I'm taking the background color, like the ambient background color, and I'm kind of just gradienting it up the character to try and make the character blend in with the background a little bit more. Other thing you can do if you sort of want to make it feel as a bit less like flat color, like sort of day glow, is we can take some of the colors from the main character and just subtly, right, sort of paint it in there, right? And what this does is it just homogenizes those colors, brings them together a little bit more. It's going to make things a little bit less sort of vibrant, right? Which again may or may not be what you want. Boom. But what we can do is always just sort of tweak that, right? So like remove it a little bit. And we can also potentially see if we can bring some of this back. So overlay. All right, let's see if we can. Yeah, just sort of pop that up a bit more. So again, that's probably a bit much, but that's just, again, an example of how we can kind of play around with the colors. I like to think of it as like when you're basically taking the background and you're painting a little bit of atmosphere of the background over everything, it's going to mimic the concepts of sort of atmospheric perspective, a little bit of ambient fill light, because the ambient fill light from the environment is going to subtly affect all the colors. And again, you get sort of an interesting mix. You can totally dial these things around as you sort of see fit with your particular illustration. Having things on a separate layer, though, I think is really sort of useful. Right, makes it a lot easier to kind of dial up or down the colors. And once we kind of have a few of those there, again, it's quite easy to sort of play around with them. Like I feel like maybe that feels a little bit better. It's sort of more blue. Yeah, hard to say. Yeah, so often this is what I'm going to be doing, is kind of just tweaking the opacity a little bit. And we're thinking about all that stuff, like what is the 1, 2, 3 read, right? Like what are we looking at? What's going on here? Yeah, and that's pretty much it. Let's see if we can add a little bit of again, really sort of simple sort of texture. Can easily just kind of break things up a little bit. I often like to do this. It just kind of adds, it just sort of fakes a little bit of extra sort of texture here, and it breaks up the lines a little bit. It's just something I often do. Again, totally sort of not necessary. It also fits with a bit of the sort of retro sort of aesthetic I'm often sort of going with when it comes to flat color. Again, sort of super subtle. It's easier to do too much of this, right? And then you're like, I always sort of wake up in the morning and I'm like, shouldn't do that. We can do another one though. I think often what does work is like a couple of larger bits and pieces here and there can sort of help make it feel as if it's, there's some sort of stuff in the air, right? Because again, often there is stuff in the air, right? Having it too clean can often make it feel a bit clean and lifeless. last thing I would do from a compositional standpoint is, let's see if we can push the, maybe change these, oh, lock that, boom. Can we make those, like, I don't think those are going to be allowed to be that bright. They're just vibrating too much, but we could do that. Boom. So yeah, there we are. Not world building, not IP development, just drawing some stuff. Let me know what you thought of this one. Again, I just thought this was a fun sort of topic to discuss. I haven't done one of these art ritual videos for a little while, so I thought I'd do another one. But yeah, let me know what you think about this concept of world building versus IP, versus thinking about whether or not you just kind of come up with cool stuff, or whether you actually are going to direct your energy towards creating some type of pitch for something. I think this is one of the most challenging things to do, but it can often be the difference between you making something that really goes somewhere versus just kind of messing around, right? But yeah, and if you want to learn a little bit more about the techniques that I'm using, especially when it comes to that color theory video stuff, check out this video, because it talks a lot about that concept that I mentioned, which is a simple plan for developing your color. If you haven't checked this one out already, I really recommend it. Again, it's basically what I'm doing right here, but in a more detailed tutorial fashion.